Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with hosts Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you will never miss an episode. Android users can find us and subscribe on your Play Music app. Apple users can find us and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. You can find us on Stitcher. You can follow us on Spreaker. And you can find the podcasts on jimmyhinton.org or findingahealingplace.com. Please rate our show, subscribe, and share so that we can spread the word. Let's get into the show. Welcome to this week's podcast. Host Jimmy Hinton.
And Jimmy's mom, Clara.
All right, well, we are pleased to announce that we are sitting in our first studio thanks to our patrons.
This is beautiful. It truly is. It has some nice chairs to sit in. There are cup holders for coffee. Notice the things I note about it, Jimmy.
Yeah, well,
it's comfortable. It is beautiful.
First thing I noticed, there's no dog in the background.
No dog groaning. No cars whizzing by. There's actually a screen where we can write notes and have those in front of us. It's wonderful. Thank you all so much for making this possible.
Yes, this is we are in heaven right now.
We are. This
and
is
we
wonderful.
owe it to our patrons. And our next step will be to upgrade equipment. So right now we don't have very good equipment, and we make do with what we have. But
We
it's,
do.
But
By the way, this is a rental space. We didn't go out and buy an office building. This is a room about 8 by 10, 8 by 8.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. It's
like
a
that.
room, and we're able to rent this for X amount of hours a month to do our podcast in. So, again, thank you all so much.
Yes, this is very lovely. So, a couple things. One, this will be our first month for releasing the exclusive podcast to our patrons. So that will only be available to our patrons who are at the $10 level and up. So that'll be released next week. And then we have our Q&A for some of our patrons. That'll be a video where you get to join in with us and talk with us live.
I love that.
Yeah,
I
we're
can't
excited.
wait
We're
for
really
that.
excited.
Yeah, that's going to be great.
And then also for our top tier patrons, they will get a chance to be on our podcast. Now that's not necessarily every month, but each of the people at the top tier will get a chance to be guests on the show. And we're looking forward to that.
It's going to be incredible.
Yeah, but we are still in need of patrons. We do have several of you who've joined as our patrons, and we're deeply indebted to you. But we do have pretty big needs for better equipment, and also just paying for our time. We have done this for a year, and each time we record, it's a minimum of 2 hours. And that's just yours and I, our time together. Right. Prep time, recording time, and then there's editing time. And that's into the late evening. So, that tacks on about another hour. So it's a lot of time. We've put a lot of time, but we're happy to do that. But we definitely could use more patrons, and if you like the podcast, we just ask that you find a way to support it. Whether that's sharing it with other people or becoming a patron yourself, any way that you can get this out and broaden the audience. The most important thing to us is that people hear this message.
Absolutely. We believe passionately that the message we bring to you is vitally important. A message that we need to hear over and over again in order to make our living safe for our kids.
So speaking of safety, later this month I'm speaking at an event locally up in Cambria County, just north of us, and they are having me speak on the tells of abusers. And what I mean by tells are, think of poker, these certain subtle signs that you can tell when somebody's bluffing, somebody's lying, somebody's being deceitful. They're having me do a talk on that. So in preparation for that, to help prepare for that, and just to get that information out to you guys who can't be there at that event, we're going to podcast that. So lucky you guys, you get to hear about this, and I think it's really important. And I was sharing with Mom, I'm going to publish a podcast. Not a podcast. A blog.
There
Thank
you go.
You said you need coffee in this room.
I
need my second batch as well.
Next time I'm bringing my cup of coffee with me. Okay, go ahead.
It's been a long week. My brain is not working. So I'm working on a blog, and that will be published also the same day as this. Should be tomorrow, which will be Thursday. So anyway, this is something that caught my interest. I've been seeing more and more stories of people dying because of riptides, or rip currents, rather. I should get the terminology right, because that's important.
Well, it is
rip currents. And I've been caught in rip currents before at the ocean, and I've successfully gotten out of them, and really with not much problem. And I think part of that is just because naturally I'm not a person who panics.
I hadn't noticed that, Jimmy.
Yeah. It's not that I don't get scared and fearful. That's a natural element of being a human. But panic is something that automatically puts you into a fight or flight. And when you're in a rip current, either one of those responses is deadly. So if your response is to fight, you're going to sit there and wear yourself out really quickly. You cannot swim against a rip current. It's impossible. Olympic swimmers cannot swim against a rip current. They're that strong.
Which I didn't know until I watched the video that Jimmy showed me just a few minutes ago. Very, very interesting. And as he tells more about this, the relation that it has to the tells of abusers is amazing.
Yeah, it's
will
pretty
kind
incredible.
Of blow you away.
So I've been reading these stories in the past week about these people, and some of them are really good swimmers who have died because of rip currents. They got into rip currents and they died. And I think the latest one was in might have been North Carolina. There's been a bunch in North Carolina this year, a bunch of deaths. But this guy, he had been married for, I'm going to say 3 days. He was a seminary student, got married for 3 days, and his brand new wife watched him drown. And
it's horrible.
Yeah, it's awful. Absolutely awful.
It truly is.
And, I thought how symbolic of what we do and how abusers work. And if you know anything about rip currents, I knew a little bit more about it before I researched this week, because this has just intrigued me. So I knew a little bit about them, and I know that anywhere where there are rip currents, the water looks deceitfully calm.
And that's something I did not know. I was telling Jimmy I grew up along the ocean, but when I would see a calm, spot in the ocean, I thought that's the place to be.
Yeah,
where the waves weren't coming in and rolling in and knocking you over, because I was taught that when that happened, there's an undercurrent that would drag you out to sea.
Which is
all
not
misinformation.
True.
Yeah.
So, there are a whole bunch of myths, but I watched this documentary, and I actually embedded the documentary into my blog post. And it's only an hour long, but it's phenomenal. It's a recent documentary. It's really good. And one of the guys in this documentary is Dr. Robert Brander. He's a geomorphologist, which basically means he studies ocean and beaches and erosion and all that stuff.
Right.
So he's dedicated the last at least decade to studying rip currents. Okay, so he puts floating GPSs into the ocean, and he intentionally finds rip currents, which are all over the place.
Right.
Anywhere where you have waves, whether it's freshwater or saltwater, it doesn't matter. Anywhere that you have waves, you have rip currents. They exist anywhere that there are waves.
Okay.
So this guy's phenomenal, but he talks about these three myths in the video, and he says, one, rips are not undertow. He says rip currents will not pull you under. That's a myth.
Which I'm telling you, I thought
I know. I grew up too, thinking
God.
that be careful of the undertow. Yeah. That was always ingrained, probably from you.
It was, I'm sure, because there again, that's what I was taught.
Mm-hmm.
Sure was.
But I always heard, watch out for that undertow because
right.
it can pull you under. That's a myth. That's simply not true. The second is it's not called a rip tide. It's a rip current. It is not a tide.
And I did not know that either.
Mm-hmm.
Always called it a rip tide.
So terminology is really important, and why that's important is because a tide gives you the impression that it only happens at high tide or low tide. That's not true. Rip currents happen. They're not related to the weather. I mean, they can be
right.
where you have more surges, but it's a wave phenomenon. And what happens is, with the water coming in on the waves, the water goes back out to the sea. And so when you have all these waves that are crashing and water coming in, there's a channel where the water takes the path of least resistance to go back out into the ocean. Well, that happens to be these little channels, typically in between sandbars, or at the head of a head that sticks out from the beach. It jettisons out. You have these different areas, piers, things like that.
Right.
Or if they're just a series of big waves coming together, that can create a pop-up rip. So, there are different types of rip currents, but anyway, it's not a rip tide. And then his third myth is that it won't take you to New Zealand.
I love
now,
that.
he's in Australia.
Yeah, right.
So what he meant by that was they're not never ending.
Mm-hmm.
They have a stopping point,
right.
and it's really not that far from shore.
Mm-hmm.
It can be up to, I think it's something like 500 feet.
The video is really good because as he's and this is a short video that I watched.
Yeah, it's less than 5 minutes.
Yeah, 4.5
The documentary is an hour, but there's
right.
a training video also that I embedded that's less than 5 minutes.
I love that. But it visually shows you what Jimmy's talking about. And it's really neat because you can see then exactly what he's talking about and make the analogy, which, Jimmy will transfer over to that now. It's very much a visual analogy that you can picture.
Yeah. So what happens is, so based on these myths, there's undercurrent. People are taught there's an undercurrent that'll pull you under. The tides, it's a rip tide, so you have absolutely zero control. And then third, if you start getting sucked out, you could get sucked out into affinity.
Right.
None of these are true. So what happens is those myths create this instant panic when somebody gets pulled into a rip current. And so they're thinking, my goodness, if I don't get out of this right now, and it is scary. I've been in them before. And they can move as fast as 8 feet per second.
But what he reminded us is you can still get air in your lungs.
Mm-hmm.
You're still breathing. Mm-hmm. You can still stay above water.
Mm-hmm.
You can, all of that. But we create this self-inflicted panic, and thereby many drown because of that.
Well, what happens when you panic is you lose the ability to think rationally.
Right.
And when you lose the ability to think rationally, and that's exasperated by the fight or flight, your first response is, my goodness, I need to get back to shore. I need to get out of this. And so you begin swimming against the current, and you can't do it. It's like swimming upstream in a river. You can't do it. It's impossible.
Right.
So, they're desperately trying to swim back to shore, and they wear themselves out quickly, which does what? It makes it go under.
Yeah.
So it's not the current that's making you go under. It's your exhaustion that's making you go under.
And panic.
Exhaustion and panic, and then, of course, waves hitting you. So anyway, he goes on and he says the number one thing that you can do, the best way to stay safe, is to avoid rip currents. Mm-hmm. And he's like, the only way that you can do that is if you're educated and you know how to spot them.
Right.
And he's standing there on the shore and he goes, here's one, here's one, here's one, and he's pointing to them.
And you can see them clearly in this video, but I would not have known, I would not have known what to look for until he educated us in that.
So, I was looking at all these parallels and I thought, my goodness, we tend to migrate just like in the ocean. We migrate to the places, some people do. I'm kind of an adventure seeker, so I hit the big waves.
I don't.
But some people migrate to this calmer water, and next thing you know, boom, you're being sucked out at a rate of up to 8 feet per second.
Right.
Exactly perpendicular to the beach. So you're being carried right out into the ocean. Mm-hmm. Well, if you don't have enough knowledge to know that rip currents are completely harmless, they're 100% harmless. They cannot kill you.
I'm just shaking my head because I'm thinking of how many people lost their lives because they did not know.
And still are losing their lives.
Right.
They said in Australia, rip current deaths are the leading cause of death in oceans, and they surpass that of cyclones, floods, and what was the third one? There was a third one. But anyway, by far, rip currents kill more people than any... Oh, shark attacks.
Oh.
And they said shark attacks are really rare.
Shark attacks,
They said that it's just a lack of knowledge. And they only have, on all the beaches in Australia, only 3% of those have lifeguards.
Yeah, I did hear that.
The rest are not protected. So I think, again, think of these parallels. If you think about it, abusers, they become this calm, reassuring person. When all these waves are crashing around you and, the world is rocky and all this stuff, they become that grounding force, that grounding, calming presence. And so people migrate to them.
That is part of the enticement of the abuser. Mm-hmm. That is part of why churches have such difficulty in pointing out abusers, because they have helped create a calm within the community of the church.
And it's not just churches, it's everywhere. No. People are not trained to spot abusers.
Yeah.
We talk about red flag behaviors, and I'll talk about that in some of my myths, but it's interesting that this guy is also known, Rob Brander is also known as Dr. Rip. So he's like the world-renowned expert on rip currents. But he's like, if you get caught in a rip current, he's like, just stay calm. Just stay afloat. You'll get out of it. He's like, if you're not a real good swimmer, he's like, just keep your head above water, save your energy, raise your hand up.
Yeah, I like.
Let people on shore know that you're in danger.
Seek support. Seek help.
You want help,
right?
And just stay afloat.
Right.
Just relax. Mm-hmm. And he's like, eventually you'll be out of that rip current. They're not never ending. And if you're not a good swimmer, wait till somebody comes and rescues you. And if you are a good swimmer, he says, the first thing you can try is swim. Try to swim parallel to the beach, which would be perpendicular to the rip current. Mm-hmm. And he's like, you may be able to get out of it. You might not be able to. But if you can't, no big deal. Save your energy. You'll get out of it eventually. And then you can call for help, or you can, take the long way back and swim back to the shore once you're out of the current. So, I thought about this, and I'm like, part of the reason why we have this big epidemic is, one, people don't know how to spot abusers. Two, we certainly don't feel that it's fair to warn people when somebody is a danger. Mm-hmm. And, we've been fighting with this church that Christine Parker had Lachelle Moore wrote this blog post about her father, who this church, who I worked at this church. I know this church really well. I was a member of this church. And they're hiding her father as an abuser because it's quote unquote unfair to expose his past sins to the church. He's a dangerous abuser.
And I knew the family, having grown up with them in my congregation, and the parallel to this rip current is amazing because the family was joyful, calming presence within the church. They are delightful people.
I knew the abuser's parents really well.
And very delightful, very pleasant, very kind people. And it's hard to equate that with the danger of going, of being pulled into the calm water, so to speak.
Yeah.
But
because I think with abusers, we're expecting this raging torrent.
Right.
And it's not. I mean, they're built on the fabric of deceit. Abusers are built upon the fabric of deceit.
And I like that phrase, Jimmy. That's a great phrase that you just used.
And rip currents are incredibly deceiving.
Yeah. When people get a chance to read your blog post and see that little video and see the calm waters, and that gentleman points out, there is your rip current. And I said to Jimmy, that's the one place I would have gone into for safety.
Yeah.
Thinking I'm walking, swimming into safety there.
Yeah. So here are some of the myths that we have when it comes to abusers. These are sexual abusers. Myth number 1, abusers groom. We hear this language all the time, just like you hear, the undertow language. Abusers, though some I think would classify as grooming, the vast majority of them are not grooming their victims, they're testing them. And I wrote a blog post about this back in February, and I'll link to that in this post that I'm going to post tomorrow. But abusers, they don't groom their victims. To groom is to prepare somebody or get them ready for action. That's what the word groom means. To test means to test boundaries and find out where vulnerabilities are so that you can go in and meet your goal.
Right.
They already know what the goal is.
Absolutely. And that's a much better descriptive word to use. Much better than grooming, because grooming gives the idea that actually you can kind of spot this person making preparation for his prey, so to speak.
Yeah. But not only that, I think grooming has the implication that the victim has no control whatsoever.
Right.
That it's they're secretly grooming you and stringing you along, and the reality is they're just using simple testing techniques.
The testing is a much better word, because in thinking back over our own situation within our family, there was so much testing going on. We didn't know that that's what it was.
No.
We were not able to identify it because we thought we were in safe, calm water. But, obviously we were deceived.
Well, myth number 2 is that having 2 people present keeps kids safe. I hear this all the time, the 2 deep rule. We always have to have 2 people present. Well, okay, I'm all for that. Okay, I'm not in favor of having one person alone with kids. So please don't mistake that. But I said in my blog post, having 2 people present with a minor makes them no more safe than having 2 people present with a swimmer keeps them out of rip currents. Right. Like entire families get swept into rip currents.
Absolutely.
What's important is having people who know how to identify abusive people. Because
it's critical to have people who can identify.
It doesn't matter if you have 2 people or 200 people who are watching over this kid. An abuser can still come in and they can abuse a child.
Well,
easily.
How many blogs have you written, and how many podcasts have we done about abusing in plain sight?
Yeah.
They get joy, a thrill out of doing that. So.
Yeah. Myth number 3, increased visibility does not equal decreased risk. So I hear this all the time. Well, we need to make sure there are windows in all the doors, and we have high visibility throughout our buildings, and then all of a sudden I watch people's guard come down. What's fun for me is to do my facility walkthrough and to say, okay, I ask them the question. I'm like, what do you guys do? What have you done? What have you accomplished here to make this a safer space? Like, I just want to know what I'm working with. Mm-hmm. Inevitably, the very first thing that people list, almost always, this is almost 100% of the time, they'll say, well, we have high visibility here. We have windows in all the doors. And I'm like, okay, let me do a demonstration. And I'm like, let's walk to the first classroom. I'll go to the very first classroom that I see. I'm like, window in the door, right? I'm like, I'll take a volunteer, and I'll get a volunteer. And I'm like, okay, can you just walk in this room with me? We walk in the room, and within less than 2 seconds, I'm completely disappeared. Nobody outside in the hall can see me. Mm-hmm. And I can guarantee that every place that I go to has blind spots in these rooms.
And we don't think about that.
No.
We just think because, like you said, because we have a lock on the door or a window there where we can be seen, that equals safety. Not at all.
But even that, even if a room didn't have blind spots, even if there was a window there, an abuser will find ways to abuse in plain sight. Like, that's what they do. They thrive on it. It's an excitement for them. They use very specific techniques to abuse in plain sight. So increased visibility actually can mean increased risk, not decreased.
I was going to say, it's more of a thrill for the abuser to get away with it.
Because our guard comes down, when we're in these high visibility places. So, I had made the reference at beaches. Is there high visibility at beaches?
Absolutely.
About as visible as you can get.
You can't get anywhere, right?
You can see all the way up the beach to the left, all the way up the beach to the right. You can see for miles and miles up and down the shoreline. And what happens?
There is still that
people drown.
Rip current.
Yeah.
And
there are all kinds of dangers that are there.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Visibility is not the issue.
No.
The issue is, do we know how to identify areas that are risky? Mm-hmm. That are going to pull us in, that are going to rope us in.
That is such a good analogy, Jimmy. Love that.
Yeah. Number 4, trained people. This is myth number 4. Trained people equals safe kids. Again, a lot of these people, as I am looking at who's drowning in these rip currents, a lot of these are really good, proficient swimmers.
Excellent. I was just going to say they're excellent.
Some of them are lifeguards who are drowning.
Right. Mm-hmm.
The issue is not whether you can swim or not, whether you're trained or not. The issue is whether you're trained with a specific dynamic. So this dynamic of rip currents, you can be the best swimmer in the world, but if you've bought into all these myths that there's an undertow, that you won't be able to get out of it, that it'll sweep you out to infinity and beyond. If you've bought into these myths, and you're a really good swimmer, if you panic, guess what's going to happen? You exhaust yourself, and you go under. So, trained people at churches or schools or whatever doesn't mean that you have safe kids. They have to be trained right, and specifically, they have to be trained to be able to spot risky people.
Keep thinking of how invalid these background checks are. I did a lot of reading this past week, and one of the main cries of people was, well, didn't these people do a background check? Well, you can do background checks from now till whenever. That's not a clear indicator at all. Not at all. They're not at all when it comes to abuse. And I think we get into that feeling of, well, we are safe. We've trained our people. They understand what abuse is. They know how to call and report abuse. And we've done our background check. We have windows in our doors. We're set.
Well, the other thing is screening people. We have a really good screening process. I heard a really, I forget this guy's name, but he's a really good, self-made millionaire and multimillionaire. he was talking about the hiring process, and he's like, all these companies pride themselves in being able to hire the best of the best. He goes, you know what I'm good at? He's like, if I'm being honest with myself, if I'm being humble, if I'm being completely honest, all of us are terrible at reading people. We're terrible at hiring, and we can go through the most rigorous hiring process and still get somebody who's a terrible worker.
I agree.
He goes, what I'm good at is identifying people who are not good workers and firing them. He's like, that's where I shine. And he's like, I don't waste my energy in trying to screen people out through the hiring process. I pride myself in observing people, and I know who to get rid of. And I get rid of them immediately.
That. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. So myth number 5, learning red flags helps to quickly identify abusers. That is an absolute myth. Our current red flag behavior, I harp on this a lot when I do trainings, it's not effective. What's more effective, and this will be part 2 next week, I'll talk about what the tells are. It's identifying the tells of an abuser, not the red flags as we know them. Isolating kids and, all this stuff that we hear. There are certain tells with abusers, just like when this guy, if you watch this documentary, I beg you guys to watch it. It's so cool.
I'm going
because
home
he's watching.
Tonight. I'm going to watch
it.
It's
less than an hour.
Yeah, I really want to see that.
Yeah. So this Dr. Brander walks up and down the beaches, and as he's walking, he goes, oh, right there's a riptide or rip current. I keep using the word. It's so ingrained in us. I keep using the wrong terminology.
We've been trained in that. And we, that's part of our vocabulary. We need to change our thinking and our vocabulary about abuse also.
Yeah.
We have to.
And we have to get the terminology right.
Right.
And that might sound like we're nitpicking, but terminology is really important, because if we have the wrong terminology, it creates these myths, and they're so deeply embedded that people can't see anything any differently.
Right.
And I want to come in and break those myths down and say, okay, it's not about red flag behavior. And it may seem like I'm splitting hairs again, but there's a vast difference. Red flag behaviors is observing behavior, and it's over a long period of time, and it's, you're looking for all of these markers, and then maybe, just maybe, you might have somebody who's an abuser.
I was going to say, that can be, red flag behavior can be an indicator that, whoa, something's off here. But it's not an indicator that will point you right away and say, that's a person.
Stay away from that person right now. So when I walk in places, there's this immediate, I can spot risky people right away. And that's not because I have some gift. It's not because I'm more observant than other people.
Well, you know what to look for.
It's these tells, but they're specific.
Right.
They're specific things. It's not just like a gut feeling.
No. And that's not disqualifying the gut feelings.
No,
because I think
not at
the
all.
gut feeling is we need to pay attention.
Absolutely.
But what Jimmy's talking about is he knows the tells. He can look, he can observe, and he sees the tells. And whoa, boy, when you zero in on that,
I'll close with this example, okay? And I mentioned this briefly in the blog post, but I think it's more important to flesh it out a little bit. But we picked my daughter up from Christian camp last weekend, and some of the board members came over, and they were like, we want to have you, and we want you to do a training, and what would that look like? And I was like, look, I don't want to sit your staff down and lecture them. I was like, because people don't resonate with lectures. Like, that might be part of it, but I was like, the bigger part of what I do is I help you to, in real time, identify risky people, and then to know what to do with those people. Okay? So, you're a Christian camp. You are a hotbed for abusers.
Absolutely.
By nature. You're a place where they migrate.
Playground.
Okay.
There you go. Yep.
So he caught me off guard a little bit, and he goes, one of the board members, and he said, well, okay, give me an example. Right now, what do you see? He's like, do you see anything risky right now? And I go, absolutely. I didn't even hesitate. It was instant. And he goes, okay, what do you see? And I was like, the guy behind me. I wasn't even looking at this guy, but subconsciously, I had seen this man, and I turned around and I said, that guy behind me, he's an older guy, and he has a young one of your young staff members, and he had this gross, had his arm locked around her hips, both arms around her hips, and he was sitting down, she was standing up, and it was this gross, his arm was draped down around her bottom, and he had her pulled in, and she was very clearly uncomfortable, and just the way he was looking at her, he was talking to her, so I was like, right, there's a man. I was like, this is highly inappropriate. At a bare minimum, he's crossing every physical boundary, and that needs to stop. I was like, this is a man who I would point to.
What's weird, though, Jimmy? We are so hesitant. We're so afraid we will offend that person.
That wasn't even the case here. The case was he didn't even see it. This board member, and it was from meters away. I mean, we were 2 feet away from him.
We're not trained to look for that. We just are not, yeah.
So, in the buzz of things, we look around and we just see people having conversations. What I see are
the tells. You are seeing
I look
the
for
tells.
These tells, and I look for
seeing them. Yeah.
Where are the eyes, where are the hands, what are the words, in that order.
The body posture of the girl who was being groped by that man, and I'll call it groped, because that's what it was. It makes me uncomfortable hearing about it. And
imagine how uncomfortable she was experiencing it.
I get sickened by it. I truly do.
So those are the kinds of things, what do we do about that? How do we identify it first, and then secondly, what do we do about it? So we will talk about that in the next episode. Just for time's sake, we don't have time this episode. But we'll talk about what some of the tells are, and then what you do about that.
And I think that what you do about it is as critical as what the tells are. Because it definitely goes hand in hand.
Absolutely. All right, well, thank you for tuning in this week, and we'll catch you next episode. Thanks again for listening to today's episode of the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast. If you found it helpful, please follow on Spreaker, subscribe on Google Play Music, Apple Podcasts, or Stitcher. Share with your friends and tell the world. Join us in speaking out on sex abuse so we can change the tides and prevent abuse.